Politics is the archaic and inadequate name for something that must pass away into the religious history of capital. There are no effective anti-capitalist interests, but only anti-bourgeois desires in alliance with zero. The notorious asceticism of accumulative Protestantism already prefigures the suicide of the last ruling class, anticipating the definitive surrender of all humanity to death. Marx says in the Grundrisse, "The cult of money has its asceticism, its self-denial, its self-sacrifice, economy and frugality, contempt for mundane, temporal and fleeting pleasures, the chase after the eternal treasure." Hence the connection between English Puritanism, or also Dutch Protestantism, and money-making. Weber remarks, "This asceticism turned with all its force against one thing, the spontaneous enjoyment of life, and all it had to offer. This is the initial impulse into capital's religious history, the sacrifice of all dogmatic theology to the ascetic ideal, which is finally consummated in the death of God. The theology of the one, rooted in concrete beliefs and codes that summarize and defend the vital interests of a community, and therefore affiliated to a tenacious anthropomorphism, is gradually corroded down to the impersonal zero of catastrophic religion. In its early stages, capital is still a matter of self-control, but after a couple of centuries, its rigid ethos withers away because there is no effective self left to resist it. To quote Weber again, "Man is dominated by the making of money, by acquisition as the ultimate purpose of his life. Economic acquisition is no longer subordinated to man as the means for the satisfaction of his material needs. This reversal of what we should call a natural relationship, so irrational from a naive point of view, is evidently as definitely a leading principle of capitalism, as it is foreign to all peoples not under capitalistic influence. At the same time, it expresses a type of feeling which is closely connected with certain religious ideas." And the capitalistic economy of the present day, 1904 to 5, is an immense cosmos into which the individual is born and which presents itself to him, at least as an individual, as an unalterable order of things in which he must live. It forces the individual, insofar as he is involved in the system of market relationships, to conform to capitalistic rules of action. The manufacturer, who in the long run acts counter to these norms, will just as inevitably be eliminated from the economic scene as the worker who cannot or will not adapt himself to them will be thrown into the streets without a job. Once the commodity system is established, there is no longer a need for an autonomous cultural impetus into the order of the abstract object. Capital attains its own angular momentum, perpetuating a runaway whirlwind of dissolution, whose hub is the virtual zero of impersonal metropolitan accumulation. At the peak of its productive prowess, the human animal is hurled into a new nakedness, as everything stable is progressively liquidated in the storm. Bataille associates the unknown with a vertiginous movement towards the void, which he also describes as the rending fall into the void of the heavens, collapsing two themes into each other which Kant had strained to keep apart, those of Noumenon and intensive zero. It is frequently suggested in the writings of the immediately post-Kantian generation that Kant illegitimately differentiates noumena from each other, and Bataille shares a broadly Schopenhauerian impetus in his response to this issue. But it is not until Nietzsche that the differentiation between noumenon and zero is vigorously interrogated, and even then this is only undertaken in a sporadic and elliptical fashion. It is first of all Bataille, and later Deleuze, who respond to this matter with irresistible tenacity, and thus undercut the phenomenological stumblings that have been the more common retort to the Kantian challenge. Where Kant resists the conflation of noumenon from zero intensity, Bataille runs them convulsively into each other. All his writings, irrespective of whether they are marked by a predominantly literary or philosophical character, are cut up by oblivion, discontinuity, and incompletion. Zero alone cannot be fragmented, divided, or partitioned, being undifferentiability without unity. But the expense of this continuity for discrete being is without limit. We are not totally denuded except in going without fraudulence to the unknown. It is part of the unknown which gives to the experience of God, or of poetry, their great authority. But the unknown demands, in the end, an empire without division. In the first critique, Kant differentiates between four divisions of nothing, reciprocally correlated to the four classes of the categories. These are the ens rationis, or empty concept without object, the nihil privativum, or empty object of a concept, the ens imaginarium, or empty intuition without object, and the nihil negativum, or empty object without concept. It is the first of these nothingnesses which applies to the noumenon, as Kant writes. To the concepts of all, many, and one, there is opposed the concept which cancels everything, that is, none. Thus the object of a concept to which no assignable intuition whatsoever corresponds is equals nothing. That is, it is a concept without an object, ens rationis, like noumena, which cannot be reckoned among the possibilities, although they must not, for that reason, be declared to be also impossible. Kant makes the indifferentiating gesture equals nothing in relation to the noumenon, but only amongst a systematic obliteration of illimitable zero, crushing it under the categories of the object, which, according to their four classes, stamp it with inverse features of mathematical unity, semantic definition, substantial reciprocity, and logical identity. It is crucial to the historical force of Bataille's thought of sacrifice that it contests both the general tendency of this Kantian articulation and each of its particular elements. Rather than sharing the features of subtraction, deprivation, impotence, and dialectic, which Kant allots to the four aspects of nothing, sacrifice characterizes zero as undifferentiably pre-unitary, extravagant, unilateral, and impossible. The noumenon is not primarily an epistemological problem, but a religious one. Bataille writes that a sort of rupture, in anguish, leaves us at the limit of tears. Thus we lose ourselves, we forget ourselves, and communicate with an ungraspable beyond. When he adds that the sole truth of man, finally glimpsed, is to be a supplication without response, it is not being suggested that a reference to alterity is inherent to experience in a phenomenological fashion, but rather that experience is immanent to the trajectory of loss or sacrifice, in terms of which it is a real modification or limitation. The relation of the known to the unknown is unilateral, not reciprocal, following the pattern of the difference between restricted and general economy. Zero is exploded into general economy, in which death is, in a sense, a deception, because there is no privacy at zero, only the undifferentiable cosmic desert, impersonal silence, a landscape touched upon only in the deepest abysses of inhuman affect. Despair is simple, Bataille writes. It is the absence of all hope, of every lure. It is the state of desolate expanses, and, I can imagine, of the sun. This is the terrain of immanence, or the unknown, positive death as zero intensity, unilaterally differentiated from ecstasy or naked sensation. It is the whole ramshackle complex associated with the taste of death in Bataille's writings, leading him to remark, in Inner Experience, for instance, I remain in intolerable unknowing, which has no issue other than ecstasy itself. Throughout his writings, Bataille implicitly or explicitly repeats a deft materialist gesture, indicating that transcendent dogma does not lie in the positing of an outside to experience, but rather in the positing of experience as dissociated from its slide into oblivion. Experience can never comprehend or define dissolvent immanence, and the claim it might can be symptomatologically interpreted as the consequence of a utilitarian reconstruction into objectivity. It is thus that Bataille reiterates Nietzsche's diagnosis concerning the moral basis of epistemology, the very possibility of a problem about the relation between experience and the real, requiring a theory of representation, presupposes the deformation of experience in terms of the good, or in other words, the stable, isolated, and determinate, correlated to the caging of noumenon in the form of the object. In wild variance to the basic presupposition of overt or cunning idealism, experience is not given in reality as knowledge, but as collapse. Just as Kant domesticates the noumenon by defining it as an object, so he domesticates zero intensity by conceiving it as pure consciousness. The vestigial traces of the subject-object relation i.e., of epistemology, constrain the movement of inner experience by substantializing a pole of knowing and a pole known, even at pure intuition equals zero. It is to refuse such constraint that Bataille insists that experience finishes by attaining the fusion of subject and object, being unknowing subject, like unknown object, and remarks of oneself that this is not the subject isolated from the world, but a place of communication, fusion of subject and object. In this shift from the transcendental idealist treatment of zero to that of base materialism, there is a difference of seismic consequence. The discussion of zero intensity in Kant's schematism, for instance, is securely framed by an immunized inner sense, and characterized by the idealistic structures of representation and reversibility. Now, every sensation has a degree of magnitude whereby, in respect of its representation of an object otherwise remaining the same, it can fill out one and the same time. That is, occupy in a sense more or less completely, down to its cessation in nothingness. Equals zero equals negatio. There therefore exists a relation and connection between reality and negation, or rather a transition from the one to the other, which makes every reality representable as a quantum, the schema of a reality, as the quantity of something insofar as it fills time, is just this continuous and uniform production of that reality in time, as we successively descend from a sensation which has a certain degree to its vanishing point, or progressively ascend from its negation to some magnitude of it. This is a particularly extreme passage, much of which she will later qualify, accepting that sensation is not in itself an objective representation, for instance, and also massively problematizing the possibility of empty intuitions. Nevertheless, despite all such subtilizations, Kant never swerves from his stubborn insistence upon thinking zero in terms of the privacy of the individuated subject. This humanist usage of the nihil privativum is nowhere illustrated more starkly than in the words, "From empirical consciousness to pure consciousness, a graduated transition is possible, the real in the former completely vanishing, and a merely formal a priori consciousness of the manifold in space and time remaining." Purity is, of course, a motif of almost inestimable importance throughout the entirety of Kant's critical writings. Of its many functions, there is one that can be glimpsed with particularly sharp definition in this passage, which is that of the subjectification of abstraction, or the sublimation of death into a power of the subject. The extinction of the subject is floated speculatively as a representational schema through which thought seizes an autonomy for itself over against the passivity of sensation. Kant does not deny that pure consciousness is oblivion, death, or the subject in itself, which is to say that it is nothing, equals zero. He simply evades the issue, implicitly consigning it to the imagination. Purity is a negation to the second power, through which death derealizes even itself. Thinking these negations bilaterally leads to a transcendental idealism and an immaculate morality, whilst echoing them unilaterally leads to a base materialism and a diseased religion. On the one hand, the tendency to autonomy is soberly reinforced. On the other, it is deliriously ruined. Death is either paralyzed by God or drowned in matter. Kant is no less aware than Bataille that at issue there is a question of continuous flow. In the Anticipations of Perception, he notes that the property of magnitudes by which no part of them is the smallest possible, that is, by which no part is simple, is called their continuity. Such magnitudes may be called flowing, since the synthesis of productive imagination involved in their production is a progression in time, and the continuity of time is ordinarily designated by the term flowing or flowing away. In the end, it is the domesticated character of the Kantian notion of time which forestalls the lurch of this thought to a base materialist conclusion. Purity conditions the a priori, which hypostasizes time as such, which, in turn, idealizes intensity. Flow, as such, is thus fixed as an eternal form of representation, frozen in an endless descent to zero. It is for this reason that Kant has an entirely ahistorical comprehension of intensity, failing to grasp the positive order of its repression, the inhibition of flow, continuity. In other words, he does not raise a problem of the object with sufficient radicality to escape from the cage of epistemology in the direction of a libidinal or base materialism. He does not acknowledge that between the noumenon and zero intensity there is no difference, or that neither are susceptible to isolation. Above all, he nowhere seems to suspect the obvious fact that zero is the primary repressed of monotheistic cultures, so that its intensive impact is historically saturated. Bataille digs demolitionally into the fault lines of all these evasions in a single comment. The extreme is at the end, is nowhere except at the end, like death. Bataille's break with Kantian humanism is characterized by a ruthless exactness, as it moves sure-footedly from one fissure of disintegration to another. Continuum is wrested definitively from humanist containment. The order of the object is contested with a profundity at the scale of zero, and interiority is denuded to the point of impersonal intensity. In Method of Meditation, he replies to critics of inner experience, I understand by continuum a continuous medium which is the human collectivity, opposing itself to a rudimentary representation of indivisible and decidedly separated individuals. The critiques that have been made of inner experience, which give to torment an exclusively individual sense, reveal the limit, in relation to continuum, of the individuals who have made them. That there exists a point of continuum where the test of torment is inevitable is not merely incapable of being denied. This point, situated at the extreme, defines the human being, the continuum. The human animal is the one through which terrestrial excess is hemorrhaged to zero, the animal destined to obliterate itself in history and sacrifice its nature utterly to the solar storm. Capital breaks us down and reconstructs us, with increasing frequency, as it pursues its energetic fluctuation towards annihilation, driven to the liberation of the sun, whilst the object hurtles into the vaporization of proto-schizophrenic commodification. By tapping into the deep flows of history, Bataille ensures that intensity is no longer thought of as anticipated perception, but as the ecstasy of the death of God, delirial dissolution of the One. Above all, no more object. Ecstasy is not love. Love is possession to which the object is necessary, at once possessor of the subject and possessed by it. There is no longer subject equals object, but a gaping breach between one and the other, and the breach, the subject, the object are dissolved. There is passage, communication, but not from the one to the other. The one and the other have lost distinct existence. Desire responds to the cosmic madness pulsed out of the sun, and slides beyond love towards utter communication. This is a final break with Christendom, the disconnection of base flow from the terminal sentimentalism of Western man, nihilism as nakedness before the cyclone. Libido no longer as the energy of love, but as a raw energy that loves only as an accident of impersonal passion. Communion through the storm, no longer through resentment at it. At the level of the secondary process, a trickle of relief supplies expresses the actual parsimony of the West in its relation to Bangladesh. But at the stratum of primary desire, the West is exacerbated in its virtual generosity, in its cyclone passion, which is not merely a passion for the cyclone. Bataille. Man differs from animal in that he is able to experience certain sensations that wound and melt him to the core. These sensations vary in keeping with the individual and with his specific way of living. But, for example, the sight of blood, the odor of vomit, which arouse in us the dread of death, sometimes introduce us into a kind of nauseous state which hurts more cruelly than pain. Those sensations associated with the supreme giving way, the final collapse, are unbearable. Are there not some persons who claim to prefer death to touching an even completely harmless snake? There seems to exist a domain where death signifies not only decrease and disappearance, but the unbearable process by which we disappear despite ourselves and everything we can do, even though, at all costs, we must not disappear. It is precisely this despite ourselves, this at all costs, which distinguish the moment of extreme joy and of indescribable but miraculous ecstasy. If there is nothing that surpasses our powers and our understanding, if we do not acknowledge something greater than ourselves, greater than we are despite ourselves, something which at all costs must not be, then we do not reach the insensate moment towards which we strive with all that is in our power, and which at the same time we exert all our power to stave off.